This video is brought to you by the new range of Nvidia GeForce RTX 40 series GPUs. Nvidia sent me one of these since A Plague Tale Requiem is one of the first games to support DLSS 3. I'm going to be showing you how it performs using my own numbers, not Nvidia's, as well as how it performs in other titles such as Cyberpunk and F1 22. Click the link below or stick around to the end of the video to learn more. Plague Tale Requiem is a direct sequel to the breakout A Plague Tale Innocence. A studio that to that point had mainly been working on licensed Disney platformers like WALL-E and Toy Story, decided they'd make this dark, confronting, emotionally wrought third-person stealth action game set in 14th century France during the Black Plague. It was amazing. No game had ever explored the plague setting like that one had, with the added spin of the rats being a physical manifestation of the corruption gripping the land. At the heart of A Plague Tale Innocence was the relationship between Amicia and Hugo, a sister and brother who didn't know each other at the start of that adventure, but by its end were unbreakably fused. Much like Joel and Ellie, their bond was forged in their desperate struggle for survival, and that bond was so strong, so real, and so earned that it gave Innocence an emotional core that elevated it to that next level, that point where something really kicks us in the feels, really affects us, really stays with us. Innocence was a stunningly beautiful game, its gameplay was really clever, the rats were fucking awesome, but had Innocence not so brilliantly delivered this story of a brother and sister coming together, I suspect that it wouldn't be talked about today in the way that it is. This is all important context because A Plague Tale Requiem is a very different game from its predecessor, and funnily enough, The Last of Us Part 2 is kind of an interesting parallel. Where Innocence optimistically explored what it means to protect what we love, Requiem is very bleak because it confronts the cost of doing so. It asks repeatedly, are you willing to bear the consequences of your actions, and if so, how? By ignoring them? By rationalizing them? By letting them enrage you to act as a sort of fuel for the fire that keeps you going? Protecting Hugo has a price that must be paid by all, by innocent people around him, by those who choose to help him, and by Amicia herself. Watching it be paid over and over again results in a very different tone and message than the first game was delivering, and I know that not everyone is gonna love that. That's not the only parallel between Requiem and The Last of Us Part 2, because Requiem is way longer than the first game, and not in a good way. At some 22 hours to the first game's 10 hours, Requiem struggles with pacing, and the focused tautness of the first game's narrative is lost here. Like The Last of Us Part 2, Requiem is also a massive visual uplift versus the first game, but unlike Naughty Dog, Asobo did not pull this one off. The performance of this game on decent PCs is frankly abysmal, and console performance is reported to be just as bad or worse. A Plague Tale also delivers massive changes to the gameplay formula, with way more combat and environmental manipulation options than ever before, all of which are excellent, and they give you so much more flexibility to approach challenges in your own way. But the biggest overall shift is just how this game feels. The first game felt focused, intimate, heartwarming, and indie. Requiem feels unwieldy, emotionally distant, bleak, and very AAA. I don't mean AAA in a pejorative sense, by the way. I just mean that this is so much bigger, so much slicker, and so much more fleshed out that it now feels like a Sony game, where you really couldn't have said that about Innocence. Still, there was something nice in that's no longer here. Interestingly, I think that had this released as a debut title, free from all expectations, this would have been met with universal acclaim, because I really do think that, performance aside, this is a fantastic video game. At times, brilliant. But it's just so different from the first game that I expect at least a few fans of Innocence are gonna feel more than a little conflicted about this one.
I'm here for you. And I will give you the life you deserve. A life without fight. Do you want that? Let's find ourselves a home.
Let's talk performance first, because it is not good news. I got to review A Plague Tale Requiem on 3 PCs. The first, a humble Steam Deck. The second, an RTX 2080 Ti and an AMD Ryzen 7 3700X. And the other one with a brand new RTX 4090, supported by an AMD Ryzen 9 3950X. Now obviously, no one's running this game on an RTX 4090 right now, but Nvidia did send it to me specifically so I could test high-end performance for any game I review in future. My main review machine will continue to be the 2080 Ti, but I appreciate the fact that I'll also have the opportunity to test 40 series performance as well, since I always want to be able to give you guys as much information as I can. That's why I've started incorporating the Steam Deck into my reviews as often as possible. Speaking of which, let's do the Steam Deck first. It doesn't work on Steam Deck. I tested it a number of times during the review window because it's not uncommon for a game to suddenly become playable on deck as pre-release patches roll through. I last tested this on Sunday night Australian time and it just wouldn't boot. Play some startup sounds, but then it crashes back to the home screen. No official word from the developer on plans to get this deck verified. I did reach out to Focus for clarification on it, but I haven't heard back from them yet. For now though, A Plague Tale Requiem does not work on Steam Deck. Next up, the machine I spent most of my time playing on, the RTX 2080 Ti with an AMD Ryzen 7 3700X. This is obviously still a very strong PC by any metric, and I gotta tell you, A Plague Tale Requiem really pushed it in a way that very few titles do, and that's without any ray tracing enabled, because ray tracing functionality was disabled for both of the test builds that I had access to. We were told that ray tracing would arrive as part of a day one patch, and I'm gonna be very interested to see how it runs because yeah, even without it, performance is very problematic to put it lightly. So I never expected 4K to be possible on this card under any configuration, and that's true. What I didn't expect is that I wasn't even going to be able to run this at 1440p, and that is pretty much the first time I've been able to say that of any game running on this GPU. In low density settings, a reliable 60 FPS at 1440p is possible with DLSS enabled and with settings set to medium. This looks and feels pretty good, and as I started my playthrough, I was confident that I'd arrived at the right set of settings for a good experience. All of that collapsed when I reached the first village, when the increased density of the scene dropped performance to a very choppy and unpleasant 30 FPS. Not a good 30 FPS, mind you, that really shitty, badly paced 30 FPS. Tweaking any number of settings made no difference at all, the game ran terribly. But I kind of pushed past this thinking maybe I'll just put up with the village scenes, but that wasn't the case. It was a sustained pattern of awful performance in so many contexts that I had to eventually drop to 1080p, which did improve things but not nearly enough. DLSS on, medium settings, 1080p, the 2080 Ti cannot deliver anything close to a reliable 60 FPS, with high density scenes still hovering at around the 30 FPS mark, though it is a better, less choppy 30 FPS, mostly. I was glad to have the new RTX 4090 in hand for this review because it let me benchmark how this could run on the most powerful hardware available to see if this was an optimization issue or something else. In static scenes like this, running at native 4K, max settings, DLSS turned off, Requiem averages around 65 frames a second. If we turn DLSS 2 on, that immediately jumps to 100 frames a second. The build I was playing on was actually a beta build that had access to Nvidia's new DLSS 3. I'm not sure if that's going to be available at launch or sometime later. Either way, turning that on provided another 50 FPS. 4K, max settings, without ray tracing admittedly, running at 150 frames a second. That is pretty nuts. But what about more intensive scenes? Well, this is that market scene from earlier, the one that completely crushed the 2080 Ti. Sure enough, this is running at 150 FPS at 4K ultra settings with DLSS 3 on. I wasn't expecting that, to be honest. I was expecting at least some drop, but no, the RTX 4090 really didn't even blink at this. But obviously, no one's running a 4090, man. Hell, most people aren't running a 2080 Ti, and even if I turned every single setting to low, DLSS on, 1080p, I was still averaging around 40 FPS in this village scene on a 2080 Ti, which is terrible. So what about console performance? Well, I didn't test it, but I will tell you I spoke to two people who reviewed it on PS5 and they both said that performance was very bad. I can't offer any more information than that, but I will say that if you are thinking about picking this up on a console, I really recommend seeking out a console review of the game so that you'll know what you're getting yourself into. Sometimes low frame rates don't have too much of an impact on a game, and I would have guessed that this would have been one of them. A cinematic third-person action-adventure title should have survived a bit of a dodgy frame rate, but I just don't think it quite does. So often it feels so sluggish and unresponsive. So often massive performance dips can hit all of a sudden. So often the beautiful scenes that you should be enjoying are spoiled by the fact that your game now feels like shit. Sadly, performance here is so bad that it manifestly reduced my enjoyment, and that's on what is still a fairly powerful rig. I genuinely shudder to imagine how this runs on lower end hardware. In the pursuit of a graphical leap, Sobo delved too deep and too greedily, and while this title will no doubt age beautifully as hardware catches up with it, the story for the here and now is a disappointing one.
Look at those flowers.
Yes.
Come on, you like flowers.
What's going on?
It's a shame that Requiem runs this badly because it is an astonishingly beautiful game. Innocence felt like it was punching above its weight, where a small studio were producing visuals going toe-to-toe with AAA studios 10 or more times their size. In Requiem, Asobo have straight up surpassed all but a handful of studios with what they've done here. The scale of these spaces is their most notable uplift. Innocence was more constrained with the size of each area and the span of more distant horizons. You could still be overawed by scale, but Innocence was best up close. In Requiem, that equation has been flipped. Each new chapter delivers incredible, jaw-dropping locations that are massive, like truly huge. This is not an open world game, by the way, but some of the areas here are 10 or 20 times larger than the largest areas of Innocence, and all of it can be surveyed from up high and then explored up close to soak in the rich detail. That's an important point. None of the more detailed visual fidelity that defined Innocence has been lost here. Requiem's smaller, more intimate spaces have never looked better. It's just that where in Innocence, your memories of that game are likely in narrow, cobbled streets, or a church, or a small section of forest. In Requiem, you will vividly recall vast townships, stretching coastlines, the mountains towering over you, and caverns so large that they seem to stretch forever, every inch of them teeming with rats. But there's one critical area where Requiem's presentation lacks behind, and that's in facial animations and lip syncing. This was a problem with the first game where faces lacked expression and properly timed lip sync, but you didn't really care because it was a semi-indie or AA game or whatever. But here, the rest of the presentation is so spectacular that seeing these awkward, flat, lifeless faces and dead eyes really hurts the storytelling. It's also really inconsistent, as some cutscenes have substantially better face work and lip sync than others, making the lower quality ones seem more noticeable and jarring.
I know you love Hugo dearly, and I know you two share a bond that I cannot truly understand. But you need to open your eyes. What happened back there will happen again.
You're right. You just don't understand.
Luckily, the same cannot be said of voice actor performances, which are, almost without exception, fantastic. This is a much more emotionally wrought experience. There's so much more pain being felt here than before, and given how short the facial animations often fall, the voice actors are doing a huge amount of heavy lifting. Amicia, voiced by Charlotte McBurney, deserves special mention here. She delivers an absolutely incredible performance. If she isn't nominated at the Game Awards this year, I will be stunned. Amicia is such a strong character, but she's also coming apart at the seams in Requiem, and McBurney's performance captures that masterfully, so much of her delivery walking the fine line between resolve and madness.
How'd you like that, huh? When someone fights back!
There are too many! They'll keep coming if we don't go!
Go if you want! This is my ground now! This is where they die! Ah!
A Plague Tale Requiem continues the story of Amicia and her brother Hugo. Hugo is afflicted with a degenerative condition known as the macula, which is killing him, but it also gives him a special bond with the rats that are consuming France during the Black Death plague of the 14th century. Requiem picks up a little after where Innocence left off, with Amicia, Hugo, and their mother seeking out the aid of a famed alchemist who may hold the secret to curing Hugo. Of course, things don't go quite to plan, and brother and sister are again thrust into a desperate race for survival, pursued by the various forces wanting to bring the fugitive duo to justice. A Plague Tale Innocence began as a very focused, very intimate story about two people related by blood, but without much affection or trust for one another. Amicia didn't have wisdom enough to know how to connect with Hugo, and Hugo was a child, scared and confused by the condition he suffered from and what it was doing to him. They had a lot of growing up to do, both individually and together, and in so doing, they formed their unbreakable bond. That growing up has largely concluded here in Requiem. The Hugo we meet is more sage, more aware of his condition and the threat it poses. He's wise beyond his years. Amicia hasn't quite found the same equilibrium. She's battle-hardened and confident, but she's also far more emotionally and physically riven by the things she's had to endure. In her private moments, she's prone to despair. When making decisions, she's dispassionate and singularly focused, unsympathetic to the impact that she and Hugo have on the world around them. In battle, she's prone to bloodlust, losing herself in the cathartic release that comes from standing her ground after so long spent running. It's in these moments that Requiem is most powerful. As I said in the intro, protecting Hugo comes at a price, and that price can be measured. in the number of towns razed, the number of innocent civilians dead, the number of foes that Amicia kills with her slingshot or other means. The tally is always rising, and even though it's as a result of Hugo's condition, Amicia is ultimately responsible because she makes the decisions, she protects him, she puts him into situations where all of this destruction and death can occur. She just can't let go of Hugo no matter what it costs her or anyone else, and it's compelling storytelling to see her contend with that. But there is another story here, and it's a lot. So I really feel like Innocence was at its best in its first 2 acts, where it focused on the personal drama, and the rats and the macula were almost an allegory for the broader suffering of the world in the era of the plague. But then it started to get really funky, where Hugo was like a rat king and he had to do battle with another rat king, and it was wild. Personally, I think the narrative kind of got away from itself towards the end. Obviously, Asobo don't agree, because Requiem is like Act 3 of Innocence, but dialed up 900%. Requiem embraces wholesale the Rat King storyline, fusing it with prophecy and treasure hunts and just a whole bunch of other crazy shit, which I won't spoil, but it makes the ending of the first game look very tame and very restrained. So is it good? This is where I come back to that point I made earlier about the weight of expectations. I try to go into every review without expectations, but that's not possible, of course, especially with established franchises that we like and we have an emotional connection to. I think if I just encountered all of this for the first time, I'd probably really like it and be like, oh, hey, this is crazy, such imagination, I love it. But being able to contrast this to the previous game, I am left thinking a lot about the fact that I didn't love Act 3 of Innocence, whereas I really liked the rest. In Innocence, I was more fond of the political machinations, the church, the 100-Year War, the history, and that's an important point. Innocence was a story set in a certain time at a certain place, and that time and place both existed. Requiem is not like that. It sheds its commitment to history and invents an entirely new made-up place to set most of the story in. I think at least some of the game's impact was lost in doing that. But the flip side is that this is one hell of an adventure. If you wanted another Uncharted, but without the climbing, then boy, this is pretty much the closest you're going to get to it. There is a fantastic swashbuckling quality to all of this that I expect a bunch of people are going to go nuts for. But again, for me, I'm more conflicted. I enjoyed this story, I really did, but I don't think it hits the same highs that Innocence did, and it certainly hasn't left the same mark on me. One thing I can confidently say is that this game is too long. That's not about the number of hours, by the way, it's about pacing. The first game was a focused 10 hours, very little fat to be trimmed. My Requiem playthrough was nearly 22 hours, and yeah, you could trim a lot of that. This game had more fake-out endings than The Return of the King, and unfortunately the gameplay loop really breaks down in that final stretch as the game throws more and more combat challenges at you without making those challenges more interesting. In a few critical aspects, I think Asobo reached for too much with Requiem. The poor technical performance is one example, but I think there's no better example of that than a game length that trades away the excellent pacing of the first game without any narrative or gameplay upsides to show for it. Another area where Requiem has received a significant renovation versus its predecessor is in its gameplay. The good news is that in every regard, Requiem's playability has been substantially enhanced, combining excellent level design with an expanded suite of tools at Amicia's disposal. The result is one of the best action stealth sandboxes we've seen in a long time, and I was impressed to see just how much I enjoyed playing Requiem. Because it wasn't like that in Innocence. Innocence had a very functional stealth-based framework, but it was set in very small, narrow levels, and each enemy you encountered felt like a specific puzzle that had one or two specific solutions. Here in Requiem, that is absolutely not the case. You almost never enter narrow, linear combat areas. They're instead huge with so many different paths through them and so many different ways to either avoid or dispatch foes. The ability to light or extinguish torches, to throw tar on an area so that it becomes flammable, to fire a flame-tipped crossbolt into a barrel to act as a makeshift light source, to throw this weird rat bait stuff that will temporarily distract them. There are so many elements of the environment to interact with. Food sources you can drop on the ground, grass you can hide in or burn, explosive barrels, sacks of flour, game hanging on hooks. There's just so many options in each space, and you have so much freedom to play how you want to play. And to be clear, killing people is way more a thing this time around if you want it to be. You can continue to be stealthy, sure, but Amicia is a badass now, and she and her sling will fuck up an entire garrison of troops if that's what you want to do. This is a choice that you can make, and it's super important because the progression system is based on the way you play. Amicia can upgrade her tools, but she'll also unlock new passive traits based on your playstyle. If you're someone that's murdering everyone in your path, you're gonna unlock skills that make you more aggressive. If you're someone that's stealthing past everyone, killing minimal foes, then you're gonna unlock stuff that makes you better at doing that. I'm always super into any RPG system that levels skills based on how much you use them, so I think that this was a fantastic addition to the game. For, I'd say, 4/5 of the game, I continue to be impressed at how much I was enjoying this combat and stealth sandbox. Asobo consistently introduced new tools, new parts of the environment, new enemy types, such that I never felt like the game was just retreading old ground. Except in that last fifth of the game, where Asobo totally runs out of ideas and in an effort to up the stakes or whatever, just starts throwing you into more and more combat arenas where stealth isn't an option and you're forced to fight wave after wave of armored enemy. Sure, it's butt clench inducing, and had there been fewer of these at the back end, I might have not grown so tired of them, but this style of combat isn't where the sandbox shines, and being forced into these encounters repeatedly further exacerbated my frustration with a narrative that should have already been wound up by that point. Like those other parts of the game, combat in that final stretch ends up being spoiled by Asobo's overreach.
Stop! Die! Stay on there! Everything's collapsing! We must leave! Amicia! Through here!
So I know this review has been all over the place, so I want to be clear, okay? I really like this game. I did. So many aspects, in particular, character performance, visual fidelity, and gameplay really stood out for me. But at the same time, there's just something about Requiem that doesn't sit quite right with me. I spoke earlier about how Requiem is one part The Last of Us, and one part Uncharted, and many parts Rats. The Uncharted thing was a real surprise to me, not only because I wasn't expecting it to go in that direction, but also because of how much it went in that direction. This has so much Uncharted DNA in it that A Plague Tale has been transformed. It was an intimate, allegorical, historically themed puzzle and stealth indie or AA game. Now, A Plague Tale is a Naughty Dog game, basically, and most specifically, it's Uncharted with rats. It's a sea-crossing, swashbuckling, treasure map chasing murder sim set on a lost island populated by a secret order obsessed with the legacy of their forebears. That's cool, but it's not A Plague Tale, or at least it wasn't. I think that after Innocence, Asobo decided that this sequel would be a AAA video game, and rather than make a AAA Plague Tale game, they made this instead. It's very good, and like I said, I really liked it, but in many aspects, it's not a sequel to Innocence, it's something else. And while that thing is great in its own way, and I absolutely recommend it, I also miss that other thing that Innocence was, and I would have been interested to see that version of A Plague Tale carried further. Add to that the issues inherent in Asobo's overreaching, narratively, structurally, and technically, Requiem becomes an interesting case study in the risks of pushing a more niche title into the mainstream spotlight. So as I mentioned during the review, I got the chance to play A Plague Tale Requiem on a GeForce RTX 4090, which is a big deal because Requiem is one of the first titles to support DLSS 3, a technology that promises a substantial uplift in frames per second performance. So let's take a look at what the 40 series GPUs deliver and what that means for you. Firstly, there's the raw performance increase that comes from this next generation of hardware. Even before you turn on things like DLSS, the RTX 40 series delivers more processing power than any other GPU on the market, meaning that if you want to render your games natively, then the RTX 40 series card is going to give you a nice bump in almost any title. Destiny 2, for example, when I run that at a native 4K max settings on the RTX 4090, I'm hitting around 130 to 140 FPS, whereas on last gen's 3090, I was hitting an average of around 100 frames a second. That's already a pretty massive increase, and you're going to see native rendering uplift like that across a range of titles. The biggest gains from this generation come from Nvidia's DLSS 3, which is an evolution on the technology Nvidia delivered last generation. You might recall that DLSS 2 was essentially super resolution, where a game would be rendered at a lower resolution and then upscaled using AI-assisted machine learning to run at a higher resolution. This gave your GPU more headroom for more graphical settings and ray tracing, while being able to maintain high frame rates and resolutions. DLSS 3 takes that further because it's actually a combination of three Nvidia technologies: DLSS Super Resolution, Nvidia's all-new frame generation, as well as the return of Nvidia Reflex. Let's break those down. So first up, Super Resolution. That's basically the same thing that we know from the DLSS 2 days, and it's back, resulting in an immediate frame rate uplift in games that support it. Next up is that frame generation. This is another option that you enable in your graphical settings in titles that support DLSS 3. What this does is generate additional AI frames in between the rendered frames. Frame generation will create an all-new frame to link a previous frame to the next one, creating more smoothness and higher frame rates than we've ever seen before. The performance results for this are massive. I've already showcased them in A Plague Tale, where native 4K runs at around 65 FPS, and DLSS 2 runs at 100 FPS. DLSS 3 runs at around 150 FPS, a near 3 times increase over native and an additional 50% increase over what DLSS 2 was already providing. Absolutely huge. I got to test this on F1 2022 as well. Now, I'm not an F1 dude, but this is one of the other titles that supports DLSS 3, and you can see here how the game runs at various 4K settings, with DLSS 3 providing more than twice the performance of native 4K, and this is with max settings ray tracing enabled, mind you. Cyberpunk is the most insane example though. Now, do note that the build I was running did not include the new ray tracing overdrive mode, which will come at a later date, but running this at 4K max settings including psycho ray tracing, Cyberpunk runs at around 30 to 40 FPS when you render it natively. If you turn on DLSS 2, that increases to around 80 FPS, which is great. But if you turn on DLSS 3, that jumps to an incredible 130 FPS. That is more than 4 times the native 4K render, and yeah man, it's truly crazy to play this game at this frame rate and this resolution. There's one important piece of the DLSS 3 puzzle that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's Nvidia Reflex. This is a technology that significantly reduces input latency, and it's most typically been used in competitive games where minimal input latency is a requirement. With DLSS 3, it becomes an automatically enabled feature, so you can get the high frame rates from frame generation balanced with great responsiveness. So that's DLSS 3, but that's not all the RTX 40 series GPUs deliver. They also promise substantial improvements to native ray trace rendering efficiency, meaning that ray tracing becomes a standard feature rather than a nice to have. And Nvidia are also pushing out RTX Remix, allowing on-the-fly RTX overhauls of games like Portal or Morrowind, breathing new life into classic titles. And for content creators, the RTX 40 series delivers something very important in the new AV1 encoding technology, allowing you to stream at higher bit rates and encode faster than ever before. These are just a few of the benefits of the Nvidia Studio platform powered by the GeForce RTX 4090. So that's a lot, and it's in line with Nvidia's commitment to not only the best hardware, but also the best features that push graphics and productivity further than they've ever been pushed before. I look forward to seeing what game makers can do with this next generation of tech, and if you're keen to learn more, then click the link below to take a closer look at Nvidia's GeForce RTX 40 series lineup. Thanks Nvidia for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.